Welcome to Parallax Views. David Rovics, the great musician of folk music and sort of a protest music, continuing in the tradition of the great protest songs, almost like a modern day Joe Hill. Do you like that comparison, David?
Oh, I'm a big fan of Joe Hill, so definitely, yeah, sure, absolutely.
And how have you been doing in this sort of moment of crisis for a lot of us? I mean, it's scary times we find ourselves in.
Yeah, absolutely. Scary and strange, and of course impacting a lot of people in really different ways, and all over the world at the same time. It's just certainly nothing like anything that I've lived through. I've been reading a lot about the pandemic of 1918, which seems like the most relevant example of something similar. But it's, I mean, for me, it's I've had my whole spring tour canceled. I was planning on touring around the U.S., Canada, and Europe, and that's all canceled. And I'm spending, time with my family who the kids are not in school. And so it's obviously very different for them and for everybody. But it's perfectly enjoyable, really, for me. It's just, it's not for a lot of people. And I'm hearing from them, as I'm sure you are. And I don't know what your situations are like, but there's a heck of a lot of people suffering out there in so many different ways, whether it's from isolation or from, exacerbated conditions that already existed, like homelessness or any number of things, abusive relationships. I mean, just you name it, it's all gotten worse.
Do you tour for a living? Has this affected your livelihood at all, or?
Yeah, actually, basically, the kind of silver lining here, in a way, this sort of strange thing is that for any musician who's not any, but for a lot of musicians who are still surviving as musicians these days, since the floor dropped out of the whole merch, there used to be this phenomenon called merch that you actually sold at shows, and it was like half your income for an average touring musician of any level, whether I don't know about the pop stars, but like in terms of like anybody who's playing for dozens or hundreds of people, half of your income would typically be CD sales. And so, and it wasn't, for most of us, if you're traveling around the world playing for a few dozen or maybe low hundreds like me, you're not. It's a tight margin because there's a huge overhead in terms of all the plane tickets and rental cars and eating out all the time. So it's a really expensive way to live. So you spend like half of your money, half of your earnings on actually traveling. So then that's how it used to be. But then when you lose half your earnings, then what do you do? You could tour to break even, or just stop touring, or find a way to compensate for the loss of the income, right? So what a lot of us have done is basically, the Patreon model of like crowdfunding, basically our livelihoods from our fans in order to keep on affording to tour and make records and stuff. So that's what I've been doing. So it's worked out pretty well. So I've largely, I got a significant income from that, although it's definitely a lot of lost income from not touring. That's all. I mean, touring is still a big part of my income. It's just not as big a part as it used to be. So I and many other musicians were a little bit more prepared for this than we might have been, a few years ago. But it's, I think it's been devastating for most musicians, really, because the margins just aren't good enough for most musicians in terms to be able to weather something like this. If you're relying on touring for your income, I don't know what they're going to do. I mean, the bailout package might help for a lot of people here in the U.S., like, and a lot of other countries, wealthier countries that are doing these kinds of things, like the $2 trillion bail. I mean, some of that's going to go to us workers, and including gig economy workers. So, but that'll help a little.
I wanted to say that I've been following your music. I don't know, it has to be since the Iraq War days, the Bush days, which I know a lot of people are saying. I've heard people say to me lately, I kind of wish we could have Bush back at a horrible time like this because Trump is so bad. And I'm like, I don't know about that. I
Right.
hate Trump, but I also am not gonna try to rehabilitate George W. Bush. But
Yeah.
we'll get into some of your music and how long you've been, at it and doing protest music and just great folk songs that are about solidarity and bringing people together. But I wanted to kick it over to my co-host Casey because I only just introduced him to your music and I wanted to get Casey's thoughts on it.
Yeah, it's I enjoyed. I've only listened to the Coronavirus 3 so far. I've only listened to 3 episodes, but hilarious. I just I don't know. It's when it comes to music, especially lefty music, my greatest exposure is either like the Red Army Choir singing the Soviet national anthem, or like protest union movements from protest union songs from like the 1920s or 30s. So I've been left out of this milieu. I guess my modern music consumption is more normie than I would like, but such is life.
Where did you get exposed to 1930s era stuff? Like you're talking about like the workers songs, like the workers song movement of the people with more of a classical background who from like the Soviet Union and that whole milieu. Yeah, fascinating. I love that stuff, and it's not well known among. I mean, people these days, if they know anything about like political music, they associate it with the 1960s, but the 30s, I love that, like Bertolt Brecht and Hans Eisler. Yeah, I love that stuff.
That's actually a good question, Casey. How did you get into that sort of older music?
Honestly, when I was a kid, it was mainly like protest era music, and from there, just pulling that backwards, like reading Wikipedia articles that just go down rabbit holes, or going to Marxist.org and seeing like the musician of the month or whatever banner they have. It's mainly, I don't know. I wanted something that was on an artistic level, reaching out to what I was thinking on a political level. And it's incredibly difficult to find that in any era after 1945 in the United States.
Yeah, I totally get that.
I wanted to ask, like, if I do have a question, the biggest one would be like, who would you say, or like, what inspiration, what spirit from that era do you think you're trying to draw forth from? Where are you getting your energy from? I guess. How are you vibing, as the kids would say?
Well, definitely from that from that era. The thing is that is so different for, and at least in terms of the U.S. tradition of what we think of as left-wing music, or the protest music, and which is not a term that I necessarily associate myself with, because it's an invention of the media that is, of course, the media has to have ways of talking about different things, and naturally they invent terms, and there's nothing against inventing terms. It's just that it's not a term that was ever used by people who wrote songs of a political nature, because in the history of songs that we might call protest songs, the history is that this writing about this stuff was perfectly normal, and is still among regular people around the world. And having run a lot of open mics, I can say that regular people are constantly writing this kind of stuff. It's not, and it wasn't just because I was running the open mics. I wasn't anybody. I was just running an open mic, and people are just writing this stuff all the time. It's just that the music industry for the past 110 years or so has been creating this idea that people, that the normal thing to write about is love and relationships and stuff related to relationships between two people, basically, is what's acceptable. Particularly a heterosexual relationship between a man and a woman. That's been promoted for the past century as normative. But actually writing about other things than that, while that has long been a very popular subject among regular people too, no doubt, not to underemphasize that. It's big, love and sex is huge subject among humanity for a very long time. But mine disasters and police brutality and avoiding conscription and killing your landlord have all been very popular subjects for people to write about for many, many centuries. And one of the in terms of the political music of the 60s, especially, and but also maybe to the present, there is the overpowering, stifling problem of it being overwhelmingly a sort of white middle class heterosexual phenomenon, completely removed from the labor movement that the whole thing came out of in the first place. So for centuries ago. So it's like this makes the music of the past, of my lifetime. A lot of it is kind of doesn't have the kind of punch that the stuff had in the 30s, because it was not music coming out of a working class movement, because it's music that came out of other movements which were very legitimate, but not necessarily movements that identified with their working class roots, even if they had a lot of working class roots, like the anti-war movement, which was largely led by working class Vietnam War veterans, like the movement in the 60s. But it's associated with more middle class types, and certainly the music of the movement that has sort of stuck with us today was written by middle class people without with the exception of some, largely it's been people without a lot of a class analysis, like Bob Dylan, and it's a lot of stuff about peace and love, and not so much about the kinds of themes that were more popular in the 30s, like general strikes, and the teens, Joe Hill, even better than in the 30s, I'd say.
It's interesting. Go on.
I'm sorry. I was going to say, it's kind of sad when America's exposure to like artistic expressions of communist thought, the most popular form is probably like John Lennon's Imagine, and that's really fucking sad. But go on. Say.
I was just going to say, I like that you said, David, that you don't really necessarily like the term protest music that much, because I think what you do and what other politically sort of conscious musicians are doing, it's more just socially conscious, justice-oriented music. It goes way beyond protest. It's also about solidarity. Oh,
yeah, sure. I mean, it's kind of just about what goes on in the world, really, and so many aspects of it, really. And so just telling stories about history and telling stories about social movements of the day, and just stuff that's happening in the news. It's really the tradition of songwriting that goes back like 1,000 years at least, in terms of recorded, what's out there. It's not anything unusual, really. It's just, but it's certainly it can be hard to find, because especially if you're looking on the Billboard charts, for whatever they call the charts these days. But if you're looking in the charts, it's probably not charting, because whatever people think about the internet and things going viral and stuff like that, it largely that's manufactured garbage. The reality, as we know, is to a huge extent is that there's certain corporations that really control most of what we hear and how we communicate, and certainly the music that we get exposed to. And that's still the case now, as it was 20 years ago. There was a brief period where that was maybe less the case, I think, but it's these platforms are once again dominant. These music industry, the music companies and the streaming platforms that they're now collaborating with. It's not like it's as hard as ever to sort of reach a broad public, and so this kind of music is still not that well known.
Yeah, there's a sort of cultural hegemony that has gone on with corporations and music.
Yeah, definitely, and news and a lot of other things. Yeah,
right. I'm just curious, what was the sort of point that led you to be more radicalized, and I mean radicalized in a good way, with regards to politics? I know you were, I think, born in the 60s and probably grew up in the 70s and 80s, came of age. What was the moment that led you to be more socially conscious and politically conscious?
I mean, it was, when I was younger, I would have attributed it to various moments that I would have taken some kind of more credit for and had more of a sense of agency about. But when I look back at it now, at the age of 52, my radicalism was inherited from my mother. And it was my mother is very politically oriented, and growing up in the suburbs in Connecticut, we got things in the mail that other people didn't get in the mail, like about anti-nuclear stuff, anti-draft stuff, animal rights stuff, all this kind of stuff that we just got in the mail. At the time it just seemed perfectly normal, and maybe if you grew up in a family like that, it's totally normal. But if you think about it, actually most people don't get that stuff in the mail every day, and so it was just like it was the milieu. I went to a camp that was run by a Unitarian minister who was also an anti-nuclear activist at the age of 12. And the camp had a tremendous row camp in Western Massachusetts, had a huge influence on my thinking. And the anti-nuclear movement was very big in the late 70s after the 3 Mile Island meltdown. So that was an entry point for me. But I think the reason I discovered the anti-nuclear movement in the first place was because my mother found that camp. I would have always attributed it to the camp having this influence, but actually, how did I end up at the camp? It's because of my mother. So that's just, it runs in the family, like so many things.
So I'm curious. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of your music in the 2000s, which is when I discovered you. It was a very crazy time, even before the 2000s. I mean, there was the WTO protests, and then in the 2000s there was the Bush years. I know for a lot of people it feels quaint now, like almost a quaint time compared to now. But how do you sort of remember the 2000s and the Bush years? Because I think people have forgotten that those were, pretty dark times too.
Yeah, it's really hard to imagine now. At that time, it just seemed like, with this kind of crazy cowboy president, who was taking the country into multiple wars and responsible for killing hundreds of thousands of people. It just seemed like how this was. It felt like maybe this would be, as Michael Moore talks about Trump, like the last administration. Can
I add something to that really quick? I just wanted to say. I remember a lot of musicians and celebrities saying that they were afraid to speak out at that time. There were like real ramifications for not being a total patriot during the Bush years. I mean, look what they did to it. Even a mainstream act like the Dixie Chicks, who didn't even make an anti-war song. They just made an anti-war comment at a concert overseas, and they were punished for it. It was a very rough time to speak out.
Yeah, interesting though that later they got awards in Nashville and sold a lot of records. So that it clearly society shifted, and that's good for the Dixie Chicks. I'm glad that they didn't actually suffer long term because of their being outspoken. But definitely, it was like the atmosphere of sort of patriotic. The sort of stifling patriotic atmosphere post 9/11 that was cultivated by the Bush administration and by the servile corporate media that was just all too enthusiastic to take us into multiple wars on totally false pretenses and not make no effort to really analyze our history and our foreign policy and the CIA's involvement in Pakistan and Afghanistan and supporting Al Qaeda and all this stuff. I mean, it was just like this big sort of whitewash all that and just patriot waves a flag and bomb Muslims. That was the atmosphere for a lot of people. And it was. But the idea now that actually. Compared to Trump, one would have to say that actually Bush is a level-headed guy who thinks clearly in comparison and knows how to work in a team and is a team player. I mean, actually, and that's like, I mean, it was so obvious that he was a corporate yes man, but that also means to some extent that you have some capacity to work on a team, perhaps, to do terrible things, but still it's in a way less scary, if that's possible, than Trump, because Trump is such a clearly a loose cannon, and it's really, I mean, I don't think it's an act. I mean, I think he is also very intelligent in some really devious ways, but I think he's also really emotionally unstable, and that seems to be clearly the case, and that's really scary for somebody in his position, and that's not something I think that you could say about George Bush. Like, as horrible as he was, he was still sort of like a functional politician in a horrible way.
Like he was at least competent at like conducting a South American coup.
Yeah, I mean, he was a cog, but a functional cog. Yeah.
Do you It's interesting. I'm remembering that you did a song at one point about Rachel Corrie, the activist in Israel who was, I would say, just murdered by that bulldozer. And I'm thinking now, we live at a moment where I feel like there's more open discussion, or maybe it just feels that way because of social media, about topics like Israel-Palestine, for example. I know plenty of people now who are very critical of, say, Netanyahu in Israel. Do you feel like there's been a sea change in the Overton window at all when it comes to political discourse?
Yeah, well, I mean, definitely in terms of Palestine, there's been a change, definitely a change. I don't know if it's how big of a change necessarily, but it's not been as significant as I would hope for it to be after weekly massacres being conducted from March 30th, what was it, 2018 or something, like up to the present. I mean, it's just, the Land Day protests that began, was it last year or the year before? Now, I guess it's been, it was March 30th anyway. They were gathering to commemorate Land Day, which is tomorrow, 1976, when Palestinians were massacred for protesting the further theft of their land in the West Bank, and then the Great March of Return that started on the anniversary of that massacre a couple years ago now. They've been marching every Friday after Friday prayers to the so-called border and being massacred every week. Until the coronavirus, and now I think people are locked down in the West Bank just like they are in everywhere else in the world, just about. But I mean, as Israel has committed one just almost unbelievable atrocity after another, it just becomes starting with their response to the Second Intifada, the building of the wall, their attacks on international aid convoys, their siege on Gaza after they withdrew the settlers, the constant ongoing siege of Gaza, the water's undrinkable. I mean, after all these wars, and the last couple times they've bombed Gaza into the Stone Age, they haven't even allowed it to import construction materials to rebuild. So, I mean, the place is just completely uninhabitable, a war zone, rubble, And so the world has very slowly started to change their orientation towards Israel, but all of the major countries trade with Israel still. The only countries that are principled enough to refuse to trade with Israel are a few of their neighbors, and who have lost actual land to Israel and are host to millions of Palestinian refugees. But the rest of the world has long ago moved on and started trading with this apartheid state, and nothing's going to change until that changes.
I guess what I meant though is not just Israel and Palestine, but I feel like more people are willing to talk about climate change. I wish we would have done that sooner. I think there's more open debate about something like ICE. I see all the time now, even what I would say are almost like mainstream lukewarm liberal Democrats saying we should abolish ICE. I've seen pretty centrist sort of seeming Democrats say, no, we've had enough of this. This is horrible what's being done to these immigrants. I just think there's been an overall sea change in some ways. In other ways, I think it's not gone far enough.
I think there's like very interesting statistics from the Iraq War that are very illustrative of the whole dynamic here that we're talking about. And I think it's important to note that regardless of who's in power, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat, the Democratic voters have very little in common with the Democratic leadership. So like during the Iraq War, the vast majority of Democratic Congress people voted for the war, voted for all the military aid packages, were basically complete empire builders along with the Republicans, But 95% or something of the Democratic voters of their supposed constituency were against the war. So people like my mother, a loyal Democrat, like so many other people in this country, she votes for the Democrats just like so many people do all the time, because they're seen to be the lesser evil, but in reality, of course, they're supporting the wars. The leadership of the party is supporting the wars just as like the Republicans are, so. And then what happens? I think one of the advantages of seeing this cycle repeated enough times is that whenever there's a Republican in power, the Democrats who are not in power, and that goes for just anybody, I'm not talking about just politicians, but basically you'll find a lot more people who, Democrat identified people who become apparently radical. And then as soon as the Democrats are back in power again, you're not going to hear any Democrats talking about abolishing ICE. I promise you that.
Well, I unfortunately think you may be very right about that. It's interesting. People have been talking about how Medicare for All has a lot of support across the board when it comes to the electorate. But that's actually been true for a long time. It just seems like the leadership of both parties don't really base their elections off of what voters want at this point.
No, that's absolutely right. They're completely bought off, and they have been for a very long time. I mean, I would say that both parties have been completely bought off for the entire history of our country, with the exception of 2 years during the 1860s, when the 10 southern states couldn't vote and the radical Republicans controlled the Congress. There were 2 years when the radical Republicans, the radical faction of the Republican Party, was the dominant faction of the Republican Party and the dominant faction in the entire Congress after the defeat of the South in the Civil War. And those were the only
radical
2 years.
Republicans were the ones who wanted to really completely abolish slavery. They were in a way the ones who pushed Lincoln in that sort of area, that regard.
That's right, and they were the responsible for any of the positive changes that happened during Reconstruction, but they were sabotaged by the mainstream, what became the mainstream of their party, sabotaged by the racist Democratic Party, which was founded on racism, a party founded on racism, and then they were sabotaged by the Democratic president Andrew Johnson, who they impeached. But then I mean, basically they were sabotaged, and the changes that anytime that you think that there's been any progressives in power in this country, it's if you look into it, you'll find that they were responding to social movements, and they were doing what they did because they had to. I mean, you'll see right now during this $2 trillion or whatever it is, bailout of corporations as well as workers in so many ways. This is a bipartisan, popular thing that looks a lot like, socialism to a lot of people. But FDR's policies in the 30s looked a lot like socialism to a lot of people too. And as he said back then, I'm doing this to save capitalism, and he was also no Trump. I mean, he was also no Churchill. He was actually pro-union. So, I mean, in many ways, there were important distinctions between, somebody like FDR and somebody like Churchill or Trump. But fundamentally, the bipartisan support that FDR had in the 30s to do the kinds of really radical changes, basically implementing much of the Communist Party's platform, it would have been really hard for people to imagine the federal government supporting the kinds of stuff he was supporting just a few years earlier. But, in 1931 alone, there were 500 different incidences of mass numbers of people with guns raiding warehouses across the country. So this was the atmosphere in which he came to power.
It's
the atmosphere
interesting.
We're in now, really.
It's interesting you mentioned. Go on.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I was just saying, this is those raids of the warehouses, I think, are coming any minute now. If that bailout if those checks don't arrive really soon, there are going to be cities on fire.
Well, I was going to say it's interesting you mentioned FDR, because one thing I really enjoy about your music is that you sing about the things that I didn't get to learn about in a history class in high school. I didn't get to learn about Eugene V. Debs. I did not get to learn about the IWW, the Wobblies, the Industrial Workers of the World. I didn't get to learn about that. In a lot of ways, I had to turn towards alternative media and people like Howard Zinn and musicians like yourself. It seems like there's a complete erasure of the social movements that have pushed our leaders in certain directions over the course of history.
Yeah, that is absolutely true. But at the same time, the way that they have erased these social movements is so underhanded, because if you think about it, if you were really into English literature in high school, like some kids were, I was not one of them. But if you were, you probably were exposed by the mainstream high school, literature that they gave you. You were probably exposed to people like Mark Twain and Jack London and the guy who wrote 1984. Orwell. Yeah, you were probably exposed to Zora Neale Hurston. You might even have been exposed to Alice Walker. All this stuff is right under our noses, and that's what makes it so insidious. That you can read people like Mark Twain and Jack London, who were very much involved with opposition to the U.S. empire and very much involved with support of labor unions like the Industrial Workers of the World, and yet you won't hear any mention of the IWW. So, but then, of course, once you discover the IWW, and you wonder how can we not have heard about this, the biggest radical labor movement that possibly has ever existed on the planet, that was so influential in terms of like everything that happened afterwards, the civil rights movement, the movement in the 30s, so many tactics that they pioneered. How could this have been just like written out of history? But then they can say, well, you did get exposed to authors who are members of that union. If you had looked into it, like Jack London's background, you would have found the IWW pretty quickly. But I find that so insidious. It's somehow worse than growing up in a totalitarian state where they really hide that stuff, because it's not hidden. Like, you can go to the bookstore and buy Howard Zinn or whatever. You can find it online, right? But it's still hidden. And most people don't find Zinn still, because it's not that it's like hidden. It's just that you have to look so hard to find it that most people aren't going to find it. And then if they do, insidiously even more, perhaps if they do find it, they'll think, oh, this is crazy. This must not be really true. I'll just ignore it. It just goes against everything I understand to be the true. Like, no, the politicians, they gave us the minimum wage because they just thought it was a good idea, and they're nice benefactors. They mean well, right? The whole idea that these things were won from the blood of thousands of people, being massacred by the National Guard, that our National Guard massacres workers and women and children, guns them down in their tents as they freeze in winter after they've been kicked out of their company-owned housing by thugs, supported by the local police, that they've been hanged under bridges, for organizing a union, and that this was normal. Now, if anybody mentions anybody being hanged under a bridge, invariably it's always they were victims of racism, and it's like, which is a horrible thing too, and that should also be something we know about. But how is it that people who are union organizers and were being hanged under bridges for that? How is that totally written out of our history? I doubt you'll find a single mainstream American history book that even mentions the hanging of Frank Little under a bridge in Montana.
That kind of reminds me.
Go on.
I was gonna say, me and my co-host here grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, like arguably one of the centers of the unionist movement of that era. And it wasn't until like 4 or 5 years ago, years after I had gone out of high school, that I even heard about the Homestead strike. And
wow.
That's just how geared the education system in America, especially in its modern context, where there's a school to prison pipeline. You have more cops and schools, and you have counselors. Like all this is pushing the social reproduction of an exploitative system. And I think we're kind of hitting on that at this point. What is done about it, though? But I believe my co-host was probably getting somewhere in that direction.
What's to be done about it? Yeah,
I was going to say it's interesting. We live in a time where, I'm sure you've both gotten this. People have said to me, "Oh, you're a utopian, you're a radical, you're a socialist or a communist or an anarchist," and people who used to say that to me are now saying to me, "We need really radical change. This is very bad, especially in light of the pandemic." I mean, I'm seeing people. I just saw that there was that celebrity, Britney Spears, was saying we need a general strike. Of all people, Britney Spears. And then Fran Drescher from the TV show The Nanny was saying, capitalism is the problem. And I'm thinking to myself, we have these like actors and actresses and celebrities and pop stars saying, yeah, this is bad. Let's have a general strike. I'm like, it's blowing my mind.
Yeah, I know. This is one of those moments, where suddenly everything changes so quickly, and I also wrote a song about that. But this is it's like the sort of left-wing intellectuals in moments like these tend to get left behind by the momentum of the times, because what many people among the sort of left intelligentsia might have thought was really radical 2 weeks ago is now totally mainstream, and the public has quickly moved on from what you thought was totally radical. I mean, I have written like maybe 23 songs about strangling my landlord, largely as a therapeutic exercise to avoid actually strangling my landlord, which is a corporation anyway, so it would be hard to strangle. But but when I first started writing these songs, like, unless I was singing in some city like New York or Seattle or San Francisco or London, where the rents are insane and everybody can understand where I'm coming from, like when I go anywhere else in the world, I would just get blank stares, And then finally, over the course of some years, things started getting more expensive most places that I was touring, and so I started getting more and more people understanding and relating to where I'm coming from. But what has happened just in the past week, if you go outside of your door in this basically abandoned city of Portland, you will find anonymously posted signs all over the place calling for a rent strike on April 1st. And they're not even, whoever is putting up these signs, and I suspect it's more than one group, it's not even attributed to anyone. And that's, I think, in a way, it's like, okay, maybe sloppy organizing, but in another way, it's like, no, this is a meme. This is like something this could just become a horizontally organized phenomenon that just spreads potentially. There's certainly historical precedent for that, and there's nothing. The utopian thing. I read a book. AK Press has a book out, a translation of a book from Italian about an anarchist named Luigi Galliani, who was the editor of one of the biggest selling newspapers in the United States in the early 20th century, which was an Italian language paper called The Chronicles of Subversion. And Luigi Galliani and the whole generation of anarchists and socialists, communist people who identified in different ways, many who identifies as anarchist communist or communist anarchist. I mean, there was a whole lot of different identifiers that went on back then, just as today. But this whole milieu, I think it's important even today, so long later, to think about that. They may have seemed to be utopian. It may seem to be utopian, like a lot of the ideas that they were talking about in terms of how a meme can just take hold and spread like a fire or like a virus. But that's exactly what has happened in the past. And in 1848, which is the time period that whole generation or two generations of people that were often called utopians, of whether utopian socialists or utopian anarchists, they're often called utopians, especially by sort of Marxists from the 20th century, or late 20th century, mid 20th century. But the utopianism, whether it's realistic or idealistic or whatever, it is born out of things that really happened. And I think everybody should know what happened in 1848, that this perfect storm, which is very much like what's happening now in a way, a perfect storm of a crop failure that happened throughout Europe that led to economic collapse because all the workers in Europe had no more money, and so all they could afford to buy was food, and the price of food had gone up so high that nobody could afford to buy clothing or anything else. So all the textile factories and other factories across Europe closed, which then, of course, caused massive depression. Nobody had any money. There was famine in Ireland, obviously, and hunger all over Europe. That was 1846, 1847. What happened in 1848 was rebellions that spread from France to Russia. The entirety of Europe was basically in flames. Tens of thousands of people died in the course of these rebellions that saw every monarchy, aside from Britain and Russia, being overthrown. And, this is the kind of stuff that they are worried about, And it's the kind of stuff that happens.
It's almost like someone went through the trouble after studying these social phenomena to write a manifesto of some particular political tendency to excite this phenomenon to a long-lasting extent.
Well, Marx was really down on a lot of that. He called it reformist. The rebellions of 1848, he was like, "There's not going far enough." I mean, he was totally right, but it shouldn't be discounted that the fact that these rebellions spread across Europe is very significant, and the fact that these ideas can horizontally just spread like that without being like vertically organized is very, very significant and informed a lot of the thinking of a lot of people. But Marx is also right that they didn't go far enough. I mean, but it led to reforms that were very significant, but totally, of course, every generation of radical that's come since then has been trying to basically push those reforms a lot further with mixed success. But the reforms that happened were things like democracy, but democracy did not result in, land reform, which is what most people were really interested in. I mean, the middle classes and the cities were maybe happy to get the vote and they could do stuff with it, but for the peasants, they wanted land.
And to circle back to an earlier point, I imagine the refugees from the 1848 revolutions, the displaced communists, socialists, and anarchists that fled to the United States, may have been the impetus behind a radical Republican ascendancy, however brief it was.
Absolutely.
I'm reminded of at least one outwardly communist Union general fighting in the Civil War that we'd never hear about now.
No. Yeah, I don't know who that is, but I've never heard about. I want to know. Please send me something about that person. I'll write a song about him. But I know there were like hundreds of radicals who emigrated from Germany who found themselves in the South, and they wanted to join the Northern Army, and they went to Mexico and they took a boat up to the really, really circuitous route to eventually end up in the North to be able to join the army. And oh God, that's some serious dedication.
I was going to say, it's interesting because even when I hear people say the word utopian now, it's just, well, maybe not now in the past 2 weeks because things are changing rapidly, but people used to say to me, Medicare for all, oh, that's utopian. Or, oh, a $15 minimum wage, that's utopian. I actually don't think any of that's utopian. I think that may not be going far enough. And it's just interesting how much neoliberalism has sort of shut off our ability to imagine a better world. Although I think the silver lining of this pandemic may be that now when push comes to shove, you're seeing people from all different kinds of walks of life saying, no, we need the change now. It's not utopian anymore. We need this.
Yeah, but it's absolutely, and that's what's happening, and that is an absolutely fascinating phenomenon to be part of. But and then it raises so many questions, like, okay, so the fact that possibly that a virus, if left unchecked, that could kill a more or less random selection with an emphasis on people living in refugee camps and politicians and pop stars who know a lot of people, which is an interesting cross section of people to affect. But this you could say that it doesn't affect everybody equally. But in any case, for the purposes of this discussion, we can say it's more or less randomly affecting people around the world, and it's more or less likely, if left unchecked, to kill at least 1% of the people who get it, and it's predicted to infect something like a half of the world's population if left unchecked. Right. So that situation of losing potentially however many tens of millions of people that involves around the world, or however a couple million in the US, that prospect has led basically most of the world's governments, including the most corrupt kleptocratic governments in existence in history, I think, possibly, like Brazil and the United States and India, that these governments like this, as messily as they are doing it, like in India or whatever, I mean, there's still this concern of losing 1% of a random 1% of their population is such a concern that they're willing to undermine basically all of the neoliberal principles that they've been shoving down our throats and living by supposedly for generations, and ruining societies with all over the world with. And now that they feel like everything's different, they can just suddenly implement these kinds of programs that make the New Deal look like, I mean, that are basically on that kind of level, and that's really that's quite a remarkable change in the course of a couple of weeks, to say the least. And it raises the question, when we are facing other cataclysmic situations like climate change, which will inevitably, absolutely result in way more than 1% of the population being killed in the course of all kinds of cataclysms that are coming. This doesn't seem to move the rulers to do anything much about it. And I guess the obvious difference there is that they believe that as long as they're rich, they can survive climate change, whereas being rich does not seem to be insulating them from this virus at all.
Mm-hmm. I like that you have that song out, Coronavirus, Climate Catastrophe, Fascist Empire, 2020 Blues Massacre.
I was just having too much fun naming it. I had to just go with the longest name I've ever done for a song. I don't even remember the name. I have to read it too.
I'm curious, before we start to wrap up, I want to bring this back to music for a moment. So, I think there's debate to be had about the role that music has in social change. For me, the number one thing about music is I think it keeps people's hopes up. I think it's able to inspire people. I don't think, and you can disagree with this if you want, but I don't think alone it necessarily creates social change. But I think in tandem with the social movements it supports, it can really help create the momentum for that movement and to keep the morale up of those of us trying to fight for that kind of change. I'm interested in your take on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the role that music and good art of all kinds, theater, cinema, whatever, poetry, well-written speeches, well-written and well-delivered speeches, books, basically any form of communication. But music has a particular role to play as a form of communication because words, when sung, go directly to the emotional centers of the brains. And this is not speculation. This is now hard scientific fact, apparently, which is something that musicians have known forever, obviously, but now it's proven that you sing and sing the words and they get processed differently by the brain. Oh, you got the same vape device I have, and it's and so it music has that role to play in terms of communication, and that can do lots of different things. So with communication, you can. The thing is with art and different forms of communication is like it's the second best thing to actually being there, so there's probably nothing that beats actually, if you want to see what apartheid looks like, there's nothing that beats actually going through that checkpoint outside of the city of Nablus and then seeing the center of Nablus. There's nothing that can replace that. There's no song or poem that probably can give you a better impression of what apartheid looks like than actually witnessing it, for example. But if you
have you witnessed some of those types of things, or?
Yeah, I've been there.
I'm just curious.
Yeah. I've been there to the West Bank. Yeah.
Okay.
But I mean, there's also a lot of what you see there when if you go to a lot of different places, including even, places that really all kinds of dictatorships. You got to look to see a lot of stuff that's going on because it's not immediately visible. Hunger is not necessarily a visible thing, or the fact that somebody is not allowed to leave a town is not necessarily visible because they don't try to leave if they're not allowed to, But so a lot of it is, you can go to a place and say, oh, everybody seemed happy. Well, that's because you didn't get out of your car, maybe. But, it's so I'm not saying that necessarily being there will give you everything you need. You also need to read about it and stuff. But the but the thing is that a well-written song, it transports people to a place that they might not be able to get to without actually going there, and that's an important thing, because you can get people. It's not going to teach people as much as like a book would by any means, but it might be the thing that gets them to read the book. And also, it's a very important tool in terms of inspiring people, a sense of community. Singing together is a very important way for people to feel like they're part of a tribe and part of a movement, and solidarity and all that. Plays that role in a big way too. But it has multiple roles to play as it's in its particular form of communication that it is.
I also wanted to add just two more things real quickly, if you have the time. The first thing I wanted to mention was I'm noticing a lot of news articles now, not just in the US, but around the world, noting that a lot of people from working class towns are getting very, very upset at sort of the rich 1%ers who have vacation homes in their towns now panic fleeing. I know that in Paris, there's issues with rich Parisians fleeing to some of the smaller towns in France and bringing the virus with them. I know that's happening with rich New Yorkers panic fleeing to their houses in the Hamptons or to Martha's Vineyard or to their vacation homes in Florida. And working class people are saying, you're bringing the virus with you, and we're not going to put up with this. I'm amazed because it seems like class warfare is brewing like right out in the open in a way where not even the mainstream media is willing to ignore it anymore.
Yeah, that's a very interesting aspect of the whole phenomenon, and I would say that I'm not traveling much. All my tours were canceled, and I'm not, I'm obeying the basic restrictions that we're supposed to be obeying around here. But my impression is that there's a heck of a lot of people who have left the city, of Portland. There's a heck of a lot of driveways that have, those have leaves on them that have not been walked on for weeks or driven on, and a lot of cars that are completely covered in leaves, that have not been driven in weeks. So I don't know how many of those are just like people that are scared to leave their homes and how many of that is people who have left town, but I suspect a lot of them are people that left town. Mm-hmm. And I mean, the phenomenon is real, obviously, that you're talking about, of people leaving the cities because they're afraid of what's going to happen in those cities, and the phenomenon, I'm sure, will probably continue because whatever wrath wealthy people from the cities who have vacation homes in the Hamptons are worried about facing from the locals who work for them in the Hamptons. They're not. They're less worried about the Hamptons than they are worried about the big cities that they are fleeing, for sure. But I grew up in a town largely that had that constant class conflict going on in Connecticut. I was from the interloper class, basically. My parents were both university professors who had the summers off, and so we spent the summers in a town that was, that like doubled in population in the summers because of people like us, and many others who had a lot more money than we did, but still people that just came in for the summers and were viewed by many of the locals as outsiders, and often people who had very different kinds of values, and looking back on it, also people who are not from their religious background either, because the working class in New England is so overwhelmingly Catholic, actually, and I never even realized that as growing up in a Protestant Jewish family. It never even occurred to me. But yeah, if you want to find the working class in any town in Connecticut, go to the local Catholic church, and there it is.
I guess before we close out, I really liked your song, The Ballet of COVID-19. I think we really need that call for solidarity right now. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the importance of solidarity, because I like how you said your music isn't necessarily just about protest. And to me, that's where solidarity comes in. A lot of people forget it's not enough just to protest. We have to show solidarity with one another and realize that we're in this fight together.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, any kind of protest is hopefully trying to get you somewhere. It's not just protest for the sake of protest. And actually, I think, gathering together with a bunch of signs in front of a government building is a basically pointless activity. We need the kind of, actual organizing that's necessary to actually form a movement that's going to get anywhere is going to be far beyond that kind of thing. But the kind of mutual aid and solidarity that's necessary is I mean, at a time like this, basically, which I say it in the song, but I mean, it's when society is under this kind of stress, and not only here, but around many other countries as well. But then you're going to see the kinds of fissures that develop can go in so many different directions. But when society is suddenly thrown into a depression, the classic examples from the 1930s and the 1920s are pretty, clear what kinds of different directions things can go. And you can go in the direction of blaming people from Wuhan for all your problems. You can go in the xenophobic direction. You can put up all the borders, and you go in the nationalistic, xenophobic, racist, fascist direction, or you can go in the direction of mutual aid and solidarity and looking at it as a global problem that needs a global solution, which is absolutely the case here. No question about it. Anybody can see that if they're really paying attention. But these are the kinds. This is the situation we're in, and people need to either are going to make one choice or another. They're either going to start, robbing their neighbors and attacking each other, or they're going to start actually, working together in real material ways for real mutual aid. And certainly, the government is going to be sending checks to everybody. And the reason they're doing that, it should not be mistaken by anyone. The reason they're doing that is because they are absolutely terrified of this virus, and they're absolutely terrified of their own population. And that's not necessarily why Denmark is doing what they're doing. Denmark has a different government, and every government in the world is not monolithic. And the fact that they're sending 75% of the wages to all the Danish workers is something they're doing because they're run by social democrats who believe in doing that kind of thing, who believe that that's what the government is there for. But that's not how it is here.
I was going to say, in that regard, I almost feel like this $1,200 check is almost a way of the Trump administration saying, here's your $1,200. Don't come to us for any more help, because we're not going to, this is your hush money, basically, is what it feels like is being said in some ways. I mean, I think we do need this emergency money given to workers, and especially people who've been unemployed now. But I feel like there's an insidious aspect to it of like, here's your money, don't come to us asking for help.
Yeah, well, I think actually they're going to be coming up with a lot more aid than this $1,200.
I hope so.
If they want to prevent a revolution in this country, because I think, the thing is that they may not, the people in power never realize when the powder keg is about to blow, but they know that when suddenly everybody is suddenly unemployed, when so you suddenly go from 5% to a 30% unemployment rate or whatever, that is a powder keg about to blow kind of potential situation. And any politician who, with half a brain can figure that out, a quarter of a brain or whatever, but it's, they're going to be sending us a lot more than $1,200, but it's, whether it's going to be enough to keep them safe and also keep society safe, which happens to bizarrely coincide at this moment in history. We'll see.
I was going to say too, since I have a lot of newer listeners that are only just starting to be interested in the political shows I'm doing. They may be unfamiliar with the term mutual aid. If you could just really briefly explain to my audience that may be unfamiliar with that idea, what sort of is mutual aid? Because I think it's something everyone should understand.
Yeah, it's such a key concept, and the concept has a lot of wonderful sort of illustrations historically. And I think rather than just defining it, it's good to define it in the context that it's actually been applied in history. So like one example of mutual aid that's a really, really important. It's like from the Depression, which is a very important time to compare it to, because we're in one now. Is in the 30s when there were there was a group called the Union of the Unemployed, and I think they had something like 100,000 members just in New York City alone. And when people would be evicted from their apartments, then there would be some kind of a system for calling supporters, phone tree or whatever it was. However they did these things, I think a phone tree with whoever had phones and that sort of thing. And then they would quickly get a gathering of people at the site of the eviction, and then they would carry all the belongings back up into the apartment that the police had just employed other people to carry down to the sidewalk. And then a locksmith would break into the apartment, and they had it all set up so that an un-eviction kind of thing. So they were doing this kind of thing. There were farmers in the countryside in the Midwest. The Midwest was full of radical left-wing farmers, socialist farmers who would have penny auctions where they would all go to an auction when the bank was trying to auction off stuff that a farmer owned when they were foreclosing on their farm because they couldn't pay the rent or the mortgage or whatever. Then the farmers would come around and nobody would bid more than a penny for all of the equipment that was being auctioned off, and then they'd give it all back to the farmers. So this is mutual aid, this is solidarity, this is the kind of movement that has existed on many, many occasions before here and around the world, and it's the kind of thing we need now, not just not protests, and not we need people to actually help each other. But the thing about mutual aid, the concept has been popular in the sort of anarchist press for over a century. It goes back a long time. The term mutual aid, I think Kropotkin wrote a book called Mutual Aid, actually. But the concept is not just helping each other in the way that churches help people in the community because God said it's a good idea or whatever. I mean, whatever makes people help each other. It's always good. It's always a good thing, I think, in my book. But the idea of mutual aid is specifically a bit different in that we're talking about helping people in the context of people who are being oppressed by the ruling class forces that are trying to make us pay rent and pay mortgages and, basically do things that are impossible to do under the current circumstances.
Casey, I want to kick it over to you real quick. If you had any final comments or any questions for David.
I guess final comment for the listeners. If you want to learn more about the theoretical aspects of mutual aid, read Kropotkin. Mutual Aid, A Factor in Evolution, or The Conquest of Bread. They're both wonderful novels. And beyond that, I guess thank you very much for having us on. I hope you and your family stay safe and strong through this crisis. And solidarity.
You too. You too. And you're not still in Pittsburgh, are you, by chance? Are you in Pittsburgh now?
We're both in Pittsburgh, actually, yes.
Oh, good. Well, one of my favorite songwriters is from Pittsburgh. I don't know if she's there now, but Ann Feeney lives there. And wonderful songwriter. If you look up Have You Been to Jail for Justice and War on the Workers? And actually there's a punk band in Montreal. What's the name of the band? They do just the absolute quintessential version of War on the Workers. But that's, yeah, she's written a lot of great songs.
I was going to say, David, I just want to give you a chance to get the last word in. I like to always end on a positive note. So any positive vibes you can give to my listeners in this very trying time, and also how my listeners can listen to your music.
Well, if most of my music is on all the streaming platforms, so if you look up my name, you can find that. But I'm doing during the crisis, I'm doing a little live streamed concert from my living room every Monday at 10 a.m. Pacific time. So if people want to hear some clothed music, then tune in to. I'll be broadcasting on Twitter, Facebook, and Twitch, and I got a little section on my website for stuff I'm doing specifically related to the crisis. If people want to go to davidrovics.com.
And did I miss anything? I know I wanted to note, I like that you let your music, and maybe this is the positive note, you allow your music to be used by all kinds of different content creators. You're not necessarily very big on the whole, like, everything is copyrighted and no one can use my music type thing, which I really appreciate.
Yeah, I think it's the whole question of how artists survive is a big question, but I don't think that the solution is that we copyright everything and turn it all into sort of money transactions. But I am very much opposed to these streaming corporations that have all the capacity to determine what they pay artists. I think if they're going to have streaming platforms that are free, and the basis of the model is going to be to pay artists not enough to survive, then this is something people need to organize against. But the problem is not giving away music. The problem is not people wanting to be able to find music that's the Creative Commons concept and sharing. This is all coming out of common culture. We did not invent this music. We didn't invent this language. We didn't invent these chord progressions. The whole idea that we're doing the original stuff that that should then result in some terribly original people becoming rich while other people make music, and it's just the class implications of it. The way that it all plays out in the music industry is terrible too. But the problem is not Creative Commons. The problem is these corporations that have taken advantage of a lot of people who like the idea of free music, who are then actually making massive amounts of money and becoming completely hegemonic, in the process.
You think there's reason to hope that things will change? I mean, in all these regards that we've been talking about.
I mean, I think we're at one of those points in history where, of course, with the climate crisis, there's a timeline here. We can't we don't have the luxury of time here. But otherwise, if we did, I would say with great confidence that things will change in positive directions, because there's so many reasons why they should. Of course, there's a lot of people working really hard with a lot of money and a lot of power to make sure that they don't, but I think there's a lot of reasons in this age why things should be able to be organized better, why people should be able to communicate and organize and create a better world. But it's, whether that actually happens is very hard impossible to predict. I don't know if things are going to get better, but I do know that they won't unless people make a huge effort.
Well, hey,
so you might as well try.
That's the positive note right there. I think we have to try no matter what. I think there's always room for hope, as long as it's not that type of Obama just saying hope and change. I think we need some real hope and change, and we need to work for it. David Rovics, I want to thank you again for coming on Parallax Views.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.